Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Living History, and thank you as always for everyone who tunes in, listens to these podcasts and then sends feedback about them. I always love receiving your feedback, so please continue to send that in. There's a lot of stuff happening in the history space at the moment as we head towards the end of the centenary period for the First World War. There's anniversaries from Vietnam, there's Second World War anniversaries, there's a lot going on, so I'm going to continue to send these podcasts out and hopefully you find them as entertaining as I do to create them in the first place. Today's podcast, it's about the last post, both the bugle service and also the commemorative service that's held at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra every day. This has been an initiative they've done for the last few years to actually remember specific soldiers during the last post service that closes the Australian War Memorial every day. So I was fortunate to speak to Emma Campbell, who works at the Australian War Memorial and has just written a wonderful book called The Last Post, telling the story of both the history of the last post bugle call and also that service at the War Memorial. And it's a really wonderful book. It's not something you'd want to take to bed. It's something it is literally a coffee table book, which with wonderful photos in it, detailing the history of the War Memorial, the history of that service, but also really importantly, some wonderful individual stories. And this has become a very important part of commemoration in the modern era, is telling these individual stories. We've had more than 100,000 men and women die serving their country during times of war, and they're not just names on a wall. These are individuals who left behind families and lives, and it's wonderful to delve into these stories, and it's what they do at the Australian War Memorial every day during this service, and it's also what Emma's done in her book, The Last Post. So some really moving stories in there, some wonderful information about the history of The Last Post, and I really enjoyed speaking to Emma about it. So now let's hear from Emma Campbell about her book, The Last Post.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terror attack.
This was their finest hour.
Emma, thank you so much for joining us on Living History.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Now, before we get started, set the scene for us. Tell us about the work that you do at the Australian War Memorial, because I'm sure everyone listening would be fascinated to know and probably a little bit jealous of the work that you get to do there every day.
Yes, well, I've actually worked at the War Memorial for 12 years now. I started in a media relations role. I'm a former journalist, and so I used to help provide, information to journalists or connect them with our historians. And eventually I got to, move up in with the historians. And so I now work alongside the military history section, or within the military history section, I should say. And I am a writer and researcher. I have written a lot for our magazine, Wartime, which is a quarterly publication. And I was for quite a while there too, also the managing editor of that magazine. And I write for the website and also other little bits and pieces for the memorial. So, but yes, this is my first book. The Last Post is my first book, and it's a wonderful project to work on.
Well, it's a wonderful achievement for your first book. What prompted you to write the book in the first place?
Well, it was really an idea that our director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, had in terms of he was obviously the person who initiated this ceremony, and he really felt that after 5 years of it becoming so very successful and being so very much welcomed by the public, it was a good idea to capture what the ceremony does, why it's important, and to obviously have some sort of memento for what we've achieved with this ceremony.
Tell us about the last post, because it's one of the most significant parts of every remembrance service that we hold in Australia. Tell us about that bugle call, what it signifies and how it's come to represent remembrance.
It's something, of course, that we all know so well now. But in fact, really, it's only been the last 100 years or so that the last post music has been part of our culture. It actually began, though, as in a very practical way, as something to help guide soldiers during the day. Bugles and drums have been used since Roman times, in fact, to give soldiers commands on the battlefield and off it as well. And this was the last post really became part of a quite elaborate evening routine that the British Army introduced in the 17th century. It was used to tell soldiers at the end of the day that it was time to return to their barracks if they'd been in town, perhaps at the taverns, or just whatever their duties had been on barracks to return to retire for the night. So it really has a very practical origin. But it was about the 1850s that it became incorporated into military services and funerals as an opportunity to tell the dead that their duty was now done and that they could rest in peace. So since then it's become, of course, something that we all know so well, and almost, I guess, a secular anthem for us now in society. And it has extended beyond being used as just part of the military too. It's in fact been used at funerals for the likes of Nelson Mandela and Mahatma Gandhi. But of course, we do very much recognise its presence at Anzac Day and Remembrance Day and other commemorative military events.
Do you think people who hear the last post today on Anzac Day or at the Australian War Memorial or at any of these other commemorative events, do you think they understand the origins well enough, or have they been lost in the mist of time?
They probably have been lost somewhat, which is one of the reasons I addressed it in the book, because I think it's worthwhile us knowing where that piece of music came from and its importance in the daily routine or daily life of a military person. But I don't know that it matters terribly that it's been imbued with this new, I guess, sense and feelings of sorrow and memory and and wishing to pay tribute to the dead. It's an interesting too that the music has changed. It's now a longer piece of music when it's played. The notes are held for longer, and there is this sense that it's more drawn out and it has become very much a sorrowful piece of music. But I like to think too that there's also some hope within it. I certainly feel that when I listen to it.
Do you think that the fact that the last post is now longer, it's slower, it's a bit more mournful, is that a direct connection between the fact that we now use it for remembrance, whereas in its early days it was used as a tool to alert soldiers?
Absolutely. I think that is a direct, indirectly in relation to that. I think what's also interesting is, in fact, that commemoration itself has, certainly in its modern way, has not been around for very long. It's funny. I mean, we think it's so much a part of our Australian culture that it would seem as if we have always done it. But in fact, before the 1900s, there really was no commemorative events. It was only when we began to erect memorials to our war dead of the like which we started to do after the Boer War that we began to publicly commemorate. And so, yes, we have then introduced obviously music such as this that has connected with that, or been a part of helping us grieve openly, I guess, in a way too.
It's a really interesting point you make, because it's something that I speak to people about quite a lot, that remembrance, particularly of war dead, is so ingrained in Australian culture that we just think of it as something so natural. But it's a relatively modern addition to our culture, isn't it? Because really everything that we do, and these memorial services, Anzac Day, the connection, the Australian War Memorial itself, all hark back to the First World War, don't they? To this immense tragedy when so many people were killed and so many families and communities were grieving. And we can really trace the spirit of remembrance and the culture of remembrance directly back to that event, can't we?
Absolutely, we certainly can. I mean, I mentioned the Boer War, but it was still in a very, very relatively small stage at that point. It wasn't, as you say, until the First World War, and that was such a momentous event in the lives of so many people around the world, obviously, but in Australians as well, and in such a young new nation, I guess you might say, in terms of its European connections, and also a small population with 62,000 men and women who were killed in that war for Australia. Then it was very, it just was such an enormous thing that there had to be a way to recognise its importance for people. And commemoration became so big here because people couldn't go and visit the grave of their loved one who was killed in the war as readily or as easily as they could if they were a British family or a French family. So we needed to set up public memorials, I guess, in order to respond to that need of individual families.
It's something that we see quite a bit of, and that I talk to people when I discuss the history of the First World War. I discuss it when we're on the battlefields and walking through these cemeteries, that the Australian way of remembering our dead from the Great War, from that huge war, is quite different to how the British and the Europeans did it, and how the Americans did it, and how the Canadians did it. It's quite uniquely Australian. And I mean, the War Memorial itself, the institution exists as part of that, but obviously the Last Post and local town memorials play a very important role in that culture of remembrance, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even today, I think most people from if you're from a country town, you recall and you know exactly where the war memorial is in your town, or you might have gone to school and be well aware that there was an honour board dedicated to the men who served in the First World War, and then later probably the names of those who served in the Second World War were added. Yeah, it's really such an enormous part of who we are today. And yes, of course, the war memorial itself in Canberra came directly out of the First World War. It was Charles Bean, the First World War official correspondent, who came up with the idea of the memorial because of what he witnessed, particularly on the battlefields of the Western Front, particularly at Pozieres, and the loss of so many men there. And he really just felt that we could not let this go by without proper proper acknowledgement of what these men had done and helping people understand why they had done it. I think that's also really important part as part of commemoration. It's not just about the sorrow. It's not just about remembering. It is important to have a purpose to it. And I think that's what we work really hard to do at the memorial, is to try and also educate people on the Australian experience of war.
I think the First World War, from my point of view, the one thing that it did for members of the public, for Australia as a whole, is this was the first time war became a huge collective event. This was the first time that ordinary men and women went off to fight, and lots of them didn't come back. Up until that point, I think a career in the military was seen as just that. It was seen as a career. It was a very noble career to go off and be a soldier. Probably quite similar to how it is today, but it was something that people chose to do. But the First World War and then the Second World War and then even Vietnam and Korea and these other wars we had in the 20th century brought the population close to war, didn't they? This really was the first time that ordinary people could find themselves entangled in a war, and communities as a whole would then have to suffer the consequences of losing so many young men.
Oh, that's right. I mean, the voluntary nature of our first and second AIF in particular meant that, it was really part of everyone's lives. And obviously, too, then the home front efforts to support those men and women who went off and fought were massive. I mean, we had really the Red Cross began in Australia because of the First World War, and was such an enormous part of supporting the war effort, along with the Australian Comforts Funds and so many other individual smaller societies and organisations. And yes, it's really was a huge effort by so many people, and it really did touch so many lives.
Now, one of the things I really enjoyed about reading your book, The Last Post, was that it doesn't just tell the story of the bugle call and of the service at the War Memorial, but it intertwines an integral part of the Australian War Memorial, which is the roll of honour, the names of more than 100,000 people that really form the backdrop whenever we hear The Last Post at the Australian War Memorial. And what I'd love to do, if you would like to, is delve a little bit deeper into some of these stories, because this is the reason that we're here. This is the reason we remember military history. It's the reason we go to the War Memorial, is to remember these people who are recorded there. So can we delve into a little bit more of the stories of these people, and perhaps starting with one that you mentioned to me was Sister Caroline Ennis. Can you tell us her story?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that, the personal stories, I think, are really the way that we do help connect, ordinary everyday Australians of today to their military history and to commemoration. So that is why this ceremony, the Last Post ceremony, and the biographies that are read as part of that are so important. And yes, so we choose one individual every day to honour. Their name is taken from those 102,800 people who were on the Roll of Honour. And Sister Caroline Mary Ennis, she, in fact, served in the Second World War. She was with the 10th Australian General Hospital in the Australian Army Nursing Service. She was a woman from Swan Hill in Victoria, and she had studied to be a nurse at Beechworth Hospital and had gone on and done some nursing. She enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force in August 1940 and was attached to the 10th Australian General Hospital, which went to Singapore. Now, of course, we know that Singapore fell to the Japanese early in 1941. And so Sister Ennis, along with nurses who she was serving with, were evacuated from the island, along also with some civilians who lived in Singapore. So they were on board the ship, the Vinabrook, and it was bombed by the Japanese. And she helped evacuate people from the ship, getting them onto life rafts and into craft as much as possible. There were some nurses who just swam directly from the ship, and others. Anyway, she was on, though, a raft with two civilian children that her and another nurse had rescued from the sinking ship. And they spent a couple of days on this raft, along with some other nurses. However, many of the nurses decided to leave the raft and swim for nearby Banker Island to lighten the load as well. Sister Caroline Ennis stayed on the raft and was last seen heading out further to open sea, cradling these two small children, a Chinese boy and an English girl. They were never seen again. She was 28 years old.
Just a heartbreaking story. And I find this when I stand and look at the Roll of Honour at the Australian War Memorial, that just every one of those names would have a similar story. They're just tales of heartbreak and loss. And do you find that when people stand there and when they look at the names, when they participate in the last post service, do you think they understand the significance of just so many heartbreaking stories that lie behind each of those names?
We hope so, which is why we do put this ceremony together every day, and why this book has been written as well, to help share some of those stories. I think it's impossible when you just see the names on the wall to really take in what could potentially have happened to all of those people. And, there are obviously many people whose stories are quite similar. The Australian infantrymen's experience in the First World War can be very similar. They turned up, they served for a couple of months or maybe a couple of years, and then they sadly were in the wrong place at the wrong time a lot of the time, and they were blown to pieces by a shell or the like. But there are also just so many individually tragic and sad stories. None of those 102,000 end well. It's all very sad, and it can be very overwhelming for people. We don't want to overwhelm them, but we do believe it's important they understand the sorts of sacrifices that have been made. And so this is a really great way of doing it. And I think people can, when they hear these individual stories, such as Sister Ennis, there's always something that they can relate to. There's something that they can empathise or sympathise with. And they see her not just as a name anymore. They know that she was a person who loved and was loved. She was a daughter. She was probably an aunt. She was important.
I think you're absolutely right. And when people stand there and look at those names, it's the same as when they go to a cemetery in Belgium, for example, or France or in Gallipoli, and they see the thousands of headstones there. The one thing, there's almost a disconnect, because the scale is so enormous that you can't look at thousands of names or thousands of headstones and actually process that each one of those was a son or a father or a daughter. It's just impossible to do. So the scale is at the same time overwhelming, but also impossible to comprehend. And so I think that's where your book really played a really wonderful role in helping to bring some of those stories to life. I really enjoyed that about it. Why don't we talk about the last post service at the Australian War Memorial, because we've mentioned it several times. For people who haven't attended, tell us a little bit about the service, its origins, and how it works today.
Yeah, sure. We have had a closing ceremony at the War Memorial for a couple of decades, actually. Every evening, we would have people gather in the commemorative area of the memorial to hear a recording of the last post, and also perhaps a brief speech in relation to the War Memorial itself, its origins, etc., and the important role it plays. From time to time, that ceremony would have perhaps featured a little bit more of a story behind it, with or information regarding a particularly important anniversary that may have been happening, such as the anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan. A historian might come and give something of a talk about that. But it was really when Dr. Brendan Nelson joined the War Memorial as director in late 2012 that he saw an opportunity to do more with that ceremony. Dr. Nelson had been in Belgium as an ambassador to NATO and the EU for several years prior, and as part of that role, he had attended the evening last post ceremony that is held at the Menin Gate in Ypres. He'd attended that many times in both official roles and also in a personal, private capacity. And he says that he had always wondered about the names that were listed on that memorial. The Menin Gate Memorial has 56,000 names of men who were missing in the Ypres salient during the First World War. And he says he wished that just every now and then they could tell the story behind one of those names. Now, they did not really have the capacity to do that, largely because there in Ypres, they don't hold the service records of those men who are listed on there. But in Australia, we are very fortunate to have excellent service records, particularly for our First and Second World War soldiers, but for all of our servicemen and servicewomen. And so when Dr. Nelson came to the memorial, he looked around at our 102,800 names on the Roll of Honour, and he thought we should tell one of those stories every day. We should research and write those stories and tell them as part of this evening's ceremony. And it really has been an incredibly successful program. It's been something that in 5 years we've told almost 2,000 stories now, and it's so well attended. The public have embraced this, and it's become a really important part of our national commemorative program alongside Anzac Day and Remembrance Day. It's a really wonderful event to attend, and we know that people get so much out of being part of it.
It certainly is a wonderful addition to the service, and I note that you can follow it live on Facebook and through other channels as well. So even if people aren't in Canberra, they can certainly participate in the service. I'm going to ask you something which is a little bit controversial now. I'm interested to hear your feedback on this. As time goes on, we don't have that connection to veterans anymore. Thankfully, the big wars of the past are really now a thing of the past, and we don't have that huge connection with veterans. In decades gone by, when we held a remembrance service, it was attended by many of the men who had served in these battles we're remembering, and that's not the case anymore. And there has been some suggestion that remembrance services have become a little bit politicised, that it's a new generation that doesn't really understand what they're remembering. How do you, and as a representative of the War Memorial, how do you keep these services authentic? How do you keep a connection with these previous generations and the original meaning of these services when they first began?
Well, I think it's actually quite remarkable that so many young people do attend our ceremonies, particularly school groups that are visiting the War Memorial, but their teachers specifically ask that they come along to the memorial, to the last post ceremonies in the afternoons. And we work so hard to make sure that the stories are correctly told, that we also not just give information about the person, but also obviously try to give some history behind their service, and to make sure that that we are opening up people's knowledge of various different theatres of war. And of course, we don't just tell, as part of these ceremonies, the stories from so long ago. We mix through. We make sure we tell. We make sure we have both First and Second World War stories, which are, of course, from people who died 100 years ago or perhaps 75 years ago. But we also tell modern stories. So there are plenty of ceremonies dedicated to people who died in more recent conflicts, such as in the Vietnam War and in the war in Afghanistan. And I think that they resonate very strongly with the public today. But I guess I feel that there still is a huge connection to the First World War and the Second World War stories.
Let's carry on with those. I mean, you actually answered that question quite well, because it was a bit of a curly one that I was throwing
Sorry,
to you.
I wasn't sure that I did. But
No, it was good. It was good. As I said, it was a little bit of a curly one, and I'm interested to hear, because it is something that people discuss quite a lot, is the nature of remembrance as it goes on forward. And as someone who's exposed to it every day at the memorial, it's absolutely fascinating to hear your perspective on it, and how remembrance has changed and evolved over the years. Speaking about those people again who served in these wars, let's talk about another person featured in the book, Private Richard Warne. He had quite a remarkable story. It brought a tear to my eye when I heard this story. It's one of great sadness and great irony, isn't it?
It really is. Private Richard Warne has become a very special story to me, actually. In the book, I have not written all of these individual stories that are here. My wonderful colleagues have written many and most of those, because I'm not a specialist in every war and every conflict. And many of my colleagues are obviously far more familiar with other theatres of war or other battalions, etc. But this is one that I wrote. I found Richard Warne's story through, in fact, our magazine Wartime. It had previously been written up in there many years ago, and I was able to do a little bit more research and get a little bit more information further on him as well. But he was a young man from Owenilla in Queensland, near Maryborough in Queensland, and he served in the First World War. He actually won a military medal for his for carrying wounded men to safety during an attack on enemy trenches at Morlancourt on the night of the 28th of July 1918. He had volunteered for duty as a stretcher bearer that night. He went on to serve out the rest of the First World War. He was, in fact, recommended for a bar to his military medal during another occasion. It wasn't awarded, but he was mentioned in dispatches. Now, so when the war ended on the 11th of November 1918, Warne and his unit returned to England to enjoy a well-earned rest there. And from there they embarked for home. In July 1919, they went to Melbourne, first of all, and then he and another friend of his had to get, by train, they had to return to Brisbane and then on from there to their own hometowns. And Warne was on the last train, the last leg of his journey from Brisbane, when he discovered that the train would not stop at his tiny village of Owenilla. It was going to go on to Maryborough and he would have to get off there. He really did not want to face the crowds, and he was just obviously itching to get home and to see his family. And so he made the decision to jump off the train as it passed through Owenilla station. And sadly, that did not go according to plan, and he missed the station platform, and he was found by a few hours after he had done this. He had jumped at around about 4 or 5 in the morning, and when the train station was opened at around 7 a.m., he was found by a woman on the tracks. His leg was very, very badly almost severed, and he was in a very bad condition, and he was unconscious but still breathing. This woman went to the nearest farmhouse to get help, and she returned with a man. That man was, in fact, Richard Warne's father.
I can't believe that.
It's quite extraordinary and obviously incredibly sad. So Mr. Warren Sr. Stayed with his son until an ambulance arrived, and was with him when he died on the way to hospital in that ambulance. It's incredibly tragic, incredibly sad that this young man was within sight of home, within steps of home, in fact, died so sadly in this terrible accident just because he just couldn't wait to get home.
What a heart-wrenching tale. And again, it's why your book is so important, why remembering these individuals is so important. They're not just a mass of names on a memorial. Each one has a story. We would never hear that story. That story would never come out. That's not a story of guts and glory that we normally hear on Anzac Day. That's just a heart-wrenching tale. It's heart-wrenching in its ordinariness. It's just such a terrible tale. I can't begin to imagine what that meant for his family, him having survived the war, having been quite brave and been awarded a bravery award, and then and dying in such a tragic way.
It really is. And I think that's a great point you make too, Matt, and which one is one that I make in the book, is that not all of the names that are listed on the Roll of Honour, those people did not all die gloriously. They all deserve to be honoured for their service. But there are many among them who died in less than desirable ways, in terms of they died just from sickness, disease, or an accident. It was not all glorious in death. And there's also, of course, a lot of names on the Roll of Honour of people who did not show their best character all the time, but yet they deserve to be honoured, and we deserve to know their story.
Tell me about, the last post was obviously always significant during these big wars, during the First and the Second World War, and onwards from there, as a tool used by the army to alert troops to various activities that were going on. Is it still important to the Australian Defence Force today?
I believe it's really important in terms of its commemorative function. And in terms of the last post ceremony, that is incredibly important to our Defence Force today. They are very much involved in our ceremony daily, and I know from my interviews with them as part of this book how much they get out of being involved with the ceremonies as readers, as participants with the Australian Federation Guard, perhaps as a bugler at the ceremony as well. They really value the opportunity to be part of commemorating our war dead and people that they might have even served alongside.
And what do you think about the future of commemoration? Is the last post going to continue to remain this pivotal part of our commemorations going forward?
We hope so. It's the last post ceremony is it's going to take 300 years or more to tell every name that's on the story of every person who's on that Roll of Honour at the memorial. Obviously, I can't speak for what will happen in the future, but we certainly hope that people will remain committed to the project. And for now, the memorial very much is committed to it. We must remember too that what we're creating here is a world-class archive, the likes of which is not seen in any other country, in fact, of the individual stories of each serviceman and servicewomen. It's a remarkable undertaking, and the fact that it has resonated so well with the public, I think, to date, in the 5 years that it's been going, shows that people really still value commemoration. They still want to remember those who've gone before us and what they did.
Well, it's wonderful work you're doing, and both you personally and everyone there at the War Memorial should be very proud of the work they do with that broad feeling of remembrance. What's next for you, Emma? Where are we going to see your name again in the future?
Well, I am actually working on another book that is, in fact, a biography of a woman named Alice Chisholm. Alice was a civilian who, in the First World War, she decided to go and help with the war effort as best she could. And she took herself off to Egypt with her daughter, her adult daughter, and they helped in hospitals to start with, and then they decided to open a cafe, and one cafe led to two, led to several, and so she in fact ran canteens in the Sinai-Palestine theatre of war. And over the course of the war, she fed hundreds of thousands of men, and she became a dame for her war work. She was, in fact, the most highly decorated Australian woman of the First World War. So her story is really quite remarkable.
Yet another fascinating individual story. I look forward to reading that one as well when it comes out. We'll have you back on the show when that book is released. But the current book, the one that's out now, is available Australia-wide. It's called The Last Post, A Ceremony of Love, Loss and Remembrance at the Australian War Memorial. And Emma, thank you so much for coming on the show and just for telling these wonderful stories.
Thanks so much, Matt.